then we have to, sorry, it was just informing me that we're recording and it interrupted. She's chatting with me. That the stories that we tell, the books we write, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, can have actual real world consequences, that there are impacts for the real world, that the television we consume, whether it's AI robot death or rom-coms or whatever it might be, can actually have impact in terms of the way we think about our identity in the world, the way other people think about our identities in the world. And so we have to really be thinking about effectively the material and real world consequences of the stories we tell. That also means that the stories we tell, if we do it carefully with intention, can be a tool for reaching people who don't feel like their voice is heard in a particular space. Every time I tell someone about my job as the director of a writing and humanities program in a college of medicine, the first thing everyone says, first, if they're a doctor, they're like, oh, medicine is an art, and they tell me all about themselves. If they're non-doctor, they're like, let me tell you about this one time I went to the doctor and the way it felt and the way I was treated and the way I felt dismissed. Everybody has a story like that. And so the idea is that if we are intentional and think about how stories work and how they're told, we can help mitigate dehumanization. That's really the mission of our program. So that stuff started when I was at the International Writing Program, where we were doing cross-cultural exchange and things like that to try to use stories to bring people together, to put forth maybe different alternative variations of stories, things we think we know about other people. And that, of course, has a lot of application in healthcare as well. So again, the mission of the work we do now is mitigating dehumanization in healthcare settings. I see it, first of all, in my students. I'm sure nursing school is going to be great, but my students experience dehumanization kind of from day one, where they're really expected to fit within the narrative of like a model medical student that's a really prescriptive person that they're supposed to be. And so I work a lot with them on what their story is, how they're doing, where they don't fit with that model, how it's impacting the way they're learning, how it's impacting the care they feel they're able to give. I think in terms of thinking about stories, every institution has a particular narrative that creates its culture, right? So we spend a lot of time studying sort of sociocultural master narratives, how they look in particular in medical education, and how that gives certain people power and takes power away from other people. So just sort of broadly speaking, that's what we do. That's what the purpose of the program is. And the reason is because our hope is that if we better protect our learners and their identities as they understand them, they will be better equipped to deliver compassionate care to their patients. So the outcome really that we're looking for kind of in the long game view is that the patients that they eventually work with are better protected and that there's less harm. The narrative that I encounter is that the arts and humanities and medicine is the soft, fluffy stuff, and it's not the serious stuff, and it's not the hard science. You will not find a lot of humanism questions on the board exams, though there could be some ethics questions, but there's not a lot about how does story and power work, and what do you feel about that? How is your identity impacted by your training? These are not the things that they're tested on. And the other really big thing is that they're not the things that are rewarded in the space of medical education. We, unsurprisingly, are a place that rewards high grades, test scores, a particular version of what we call professionalism, which comes with its own story of what professionalism looks like. And I have a student right now working on a project about performed compassion compared to genuine compassion, and his experience with performed compassion according to sort of a script is applauded, but genuine compassion is punished because it looks too much like weakness. So these are things that when we, from our perspective, from people who are thinking about stories, English majors, all of you in this class, I see it all as narratives that are perpetuated that either grant or restrict power, and that's how we teach it. Okay, so that's sort of the broad strokes. are there things in there in particular that you want to hear more about, or should I just keep kind of spieling into the details of what we do?
You said something that and it flashed in my mind. You talked about, mitigating and doing less harm with stories. And I thought of was it Hippocrates or the oath, right? It starts with do no harm, harm, which is pretty high standard. What are the kinds of things that when you talk about doing less harm, if someone said, what do you mean?
Yeah.
How would you respond? How can stories improve?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question, and I'll give you some specific examples. So the way that I teach it is from a lot of different scholars across disciplines, but the fundamental core idea is that I want first, you all are going to get a chip on your shoulder. I want my students to have a more complicated understanding of what stories are. So we start with that. Let's redefine what a story even is. It's not a plot. It's not linear. We all tell stories in ways where we lie and we omit stuff, and our stories are colored by shame and fear, danger, all kinds of different things, who we think we're supposed to be in a particular context, how much energy we have to fight retaliation if we're not behaving the way we're supposed to, because that takes a lot of energy. And so I try to, number one, complicate the definition of story. That is to say, it's not just what you do, it's not just your plot, but it's the body you occupy, it's your quirks, it's your commitments, right? It's your relationships, it's how you spend your time, with who, in what outfit. And some of that you can control, and some of that you can't control, right? The easiest example that I have for myself is that shortly after I started working in a college of medicine, I had a dean approach me. And this dean said, "Oh, you're so edgy." Okay. And I was like, I am a 40-something mother of two. I go to bed at 9. I am the least edgy person you've ever met. But what she meant was, you have short hair, you look sort of different in this context than most women look. And because of that, I read you as edgy, or she meant sort of slightly subversive in some way. I came from a writing program where I was definitely not read as edgy. My community was very different, right? So I always use that as an example. My whole story was my presentation. Some of it, my hair, I have control over. A lot of other things we don't have control over. So the number one thing is complicate what story means. That's number one. Number two, I think, I sort of talk to students about how this process is collaborative, right? Just like I use that example of being edgy, my story is going to be taken up in a different way in different contexts. So are yours. When you're sitting in this classroom, I think you probably have a lot of flexibility and freedom to tell the kind of story you want to. When you're with your family, that might be different. When you're with your friends, it might be very different. When you're in a job interview, totally different. When you go off to the National Guard, I can't even imagine. So the idea is that in different contexts, our stories are going to be read in different ways. And that means that they're collaborative, right? It's us telling our story of who we are, a patient telling the story of who they are, but it depends on where you're telling that and who's listening to it. So that's number two. Redefine story. Number two, understand that stories are told and really created in collaboration. And what that means is that this process, in terms of that collaboration, is going to be significantly more difficult for any person who is marginalized in any way or maligned in any way, right? So if the narratives sort of culturally depict my particular social kind as lazy or non-compliant or stupid or annoying or slutty or deviant or any of these kinds of things, then there's sort of like permission to treat me that way, right? The best example I can give you, the one that we see in the most straightforward manner, is our patients who come into the hospital for any reason who have substance use disorder, in particular, if they're using heroin or meth. There are too strong of social narratives that depict that individual as criminal or deviant. Those stories, most of them, my students will tell me they got those stories, by the way, from Breaking Bad. They're not getting it from real world stuff. That's fiction. But it feels like real, and it feels like they know that person and they know that story. And because of that, they have permission to mistreat that person, to treat that person like they're a criminal and sort of subhuman. And that's what we see happening, right? So that's why we teach stories as related to power. Every individual story is operating within a larger social story about their identity group. These are really complicated things. The other thing is that if you read any sort of sociology on these subjects, you'll see that we narrate other people's stories instantaneously, right? I determine all kinds of things about you the instant I see you. And what I'm determining about you is a function of actually my own identity and my own lived experience. If I'm not paying attention to the ways in which I'm filling in your story, then I could very easily harm you, because that's taking away your power and your agency to tell me your story yourself, but it also might be giving me permission to mistreat you, right? I'm thinking especially of you folks who are thinking about working with people who have any kind of either diagnosis or social position that's stigmatized, right? Being a person who's incarcerated makes it very hard to get humane health care, because we have stories about folks who are incarcerated and it gives us permission to treat them badly. We see it all the time. So these are the kinds of the sort of scholarship and ideas that we're trying to introduce to our students. So what this means is that when we're talking about story, identity, and power, we're talking about the degree to which any single person, any of you in this room, in any context, has the freedom to perform and to really embody her identity as she understands it without punishment or fear of punishment. And for some people, that's hard. For other people, it's straightforward, it's easy, right? This is for a lot of our straight white male students, they don't have as much trouble fitting in the medical world. For some of our other students, it's significantly more difficult. The same is true of our patients. So this is really what we get into, and there's all kinds of scholarship and writing and research you can look up, both theory about these ideas and data that kind of demonstrates these ideas. And I would say that's true of almost any marginalized group. So all different kinds of folks, a lot of the folks that you're thinking about, folks with dementia, folks in assisted living situations, folks who are incarcerated, folks who are living with visible or invisible disabilities, all different kinds of things, folks living with facial difference or skin difference, all those kinds of groups. There's all kinds of research that sort of indicates the ways in which they are uniquely stigmatized, and that stigma permits mistreatment. So, right, the solution is, what do we do? How do we use stories as an intervention? To me, the best way, the best tool is what you probably have heard about before, which is something we call the counter story. The example, I'll go back to substance use disorder. The way we do it here is I introduce a character to our students. I'll do it with you right now. We'll try it out together, right? What if you think about this person? She's 26, she's 30 weeks pregnant. She comes to the emergency room because she's bleeding, and she says she wants to make sure everything's okay. She explains to the healthcare team she's been using heroin every day of her pregnancy. It's her 6th pregnancy, and she describes herself as homeless, right? So sometimes I'll just introduce just those basic details about this person and ask our students, what else do you know about her? Tell me the rest of her story. We've done it with faculty too, which is even scarier. And does anything come to your mind when I tell you that? Are you like, here's the person I picture, here are my questions, here are my concerns? I assume things are popping in your head about this person. I won't put you on the spot and make you say them out loud. But I can tell you what people say, right? Probably a history of abuse, probably doesn't have custody of her kids, probably low hygiene and like smells bad, probably bad teeth, probably doesn't understand her own health, probably combative, probably not coming back for care, probably has multiple partners, maybe got being sex trafficked or something problematic going on. One of them, bizarrely, I had a faculty member be like, I'm certain she's gonna poop the bed. Like, that's very specific. and strange, but I think it's based on some past lived experience you've had that troubled you deeply and stuck with you. And now you're imposing that on this person. This is how it works. So we do this with our students. And then I show them a video of a story we recorded with the actual person. Her name is Amanda, and we let her tell her story. And it may or may not surprise you. None of the stuff that we think we know about her is actually true to her story. It's all just sort of stuff we filled in because we feel like we understand other people's stories before they've had a chance to tell us. And in this way, we're putting a sort of stereotype or a stock story next to an actual unique idiosyncratic individual. That's a counter story. And that's really powerful because you can't deny that those things don't match up, which means we have to admit we don't really know much about each other's stories. Whatever we think we know very well may be wrong. And if we can get our students, and really anyone who wants to think about equity, justice, decolonization, these kinds of questions, mitigating stigma, mitigating dehumanization, if we can think in this way where we're approaching people with curiosity and we're approaching people and thinking, what can I learn from you? Not what do I already know about you? That's really powerful. And so that's the way in which we teach our students to think about stories as an intervention to help them have a different way of thinking about the folks they interact with, but also their colleagues or the nurses on their team, or the other people that they might interact with who have unique stories that probably don't line up with their assumptions. That was a really long answer, but that's how we think about it. And really, that's what we're trying to do. And all of the topics you brought up are sort of a unique and specific lens into basically that same dynamic, I would say. Does that answer your question? I have tons more I could say, but are there other questions or thoughts that you all have that you want to get into before I say anything more?
I'm sure you do.
I was interested in the point about performed compassion versus genuine compassion.
Yeah.
Like, where is that line sort of drawn?
Yeah. That's a great question. So there's some really interesting work that I think is being done and could be done on the way we teach things like compassion and empathy in healthcare settings. Again, I see it all as storytelling, and it's so strange because in our curriculum, we actually give our students a script. So we give them an actual script of what they're supposed to say to perform empathy. Sometimes it will even include like empathetic pause here. Right? Like it's very controlled. It's very prescriptive.
Explains so much about the doctor's office.
Yeah, right. Like and we also give them specific instructions on how to conduct what they call their interviews, but their conversations, I wish we said, with patients. It involves what they say are open-ended questions, but some of those are, tell me your goals today. I had a student say that in a classroom the other day, and I was like, you are making me sweat by telling me that I have to be able to define for you my goals. I don't know my goals. You're supposed to know the goals. You're the doctor, you know, and he's like, I'm trying to bring you into the conversation. So one thing I'll say to answer your question is it's really prescriptive what we give them in terms of what they should say and how we've decided what empathetic language is, which means it's not organic or responsive to the moment or, again, the unique individual sitting in front of you. And so sometimes it leads to a great deal of confusion where they'll follow the script and it really doesn't make any sense according to what the person is in the hospital for or the mood that patient is in. So what we don't do is say, be responsive to what the person in the room needs and practice being comfortable with someone else's pain and what you would say in those moments. Instead, we're like, here's a script for what to do when you encounter somebody in pain. And so, and then the next piece of your question I'll say is we have something that in healthcare professions that is professionalism, which is a wonderful thing, I think, but we have it as a rubric. So in our syllabi, starting in the first semester, we say you're getting a grade in your classes, even in a classroom like the one you're in now, for professionalism, for how well you behaved yourself. And if you don't behave yourself, you will fail the class. That professionalism grade is very open to interpretation, but it does have a specific rubric that includes what you wear and the language that you use and whether or not you have a low bun. I had a student who had a faculty member be like, I prefer my female med students in a low bun. And she was like, oh my, I have to do a low bun every day now. Very, very specific. I know, it's bizarre. And one of the aspects of this rubric is you're not allowed to lose your composure. So there's a degree to which we're actually controlling how much we permit our trainees to emote, to have emotion in a clinical setting. And so if they lose their composure, they're subject to, at least at Iowa, a disciplinary process where they are punished. And so in that way, it's specifically punished. Sometimes compassion can be specifically punished. And so our students really have to take care with what they show or how much they connect kind of human to human with their patients, because they have this sort of threat of failing or of a disciplinary process if they don't maintain their composure. So that's really what it looks like. And it's very concrete and codified, but it leads students to relying on that script of empathy that they get early on, rather than perhaps what feels organic and natural and called for in the moment. It's also still, I mean, this is not new information, but medicine is very patriarchal. And so the other part of this, to complete the answer to your question, is it's still a place where emotion is often conflated with weakness. It's true that a lot of physicians get impatient with their patients that are in pain, and where the sort of expression of vulnerability and emotion is socially punished because it's identified as weak. And so that's part of that's a cultural aspect of it. That's something that's culturally perpetuated in healthcare. There's a lot of like, I stayed up all night and did a 24-hour shift and didn't eat, and that gets like a badge of honor, right? Which is very problematic. So I would say in terms of compassion and why we struggle and we have a deficit of compassion, it's for some of those reasons. And again, like those things are just stories that we're telling. We could change it. We could tell a different story. We could say vulnerability and emotion are incredibly difficult and signs of bravery and honesty, not signs of weakness. It would take telling a different version of the story.
Has there been, I joked a little bit when we talked last time about when well-paid physicians have burnout. Mm-hmm. And I have no doubt that they do, we do too. But it strikes me fascinating that there's an obvious thread to me between the challenges you face in your program, competing for attention and funds and your own lane and validation, and the social credit system and the compassion that includes self-compassion, that include, right? It seems this notion that it's not as much the external factors that are leading to the burnout. It is the things we are denying generations of caregivers the tools for resilience. Yeah.
So I think it's both. I think you're right. So one of the biggest things that I talk to students about is, and I don't know if y'all have this, but they struggle with feeling like if they don't do well in school, it's a personal failing. If they're struggling in their learning environment, it's their fault, right? They have a sense of imposter syndrome. They have a sense of what the expectations are. They have a sense of being valued as a person based on grades, numbers, and scores. And then when they're in distress, they feel like I just wasn't resilient enough. I didn't adopt that military mindset and muscle through this, rather than I think some of this is being imposed upon you by the learning environment and this is being done to you, you are not failing in this context. That's a really difficult conversation to have, but I think it's a really important one, and it allows them to maybe struggle, but to not have an experience of shame. We have a lot of shame. The shame experience is one that it's not just guilt that you feel bad, it's that you feel like you're not worthy as a person. And that's caused by that learning environment, and it absolutely leads to learner burnout, because people, they'll again sort of take that blame on themselves and internalize it, and that's a spiral that is not going to result in anything good. I think that's to some extent can continue into their years as residents and providers. I think sometimes the shame has to do with two things. One is if there's ever a rough day, a mistake, a patient has struggles, a patient is frustrated, and sort of there's a lot of conversation around shame of the sort of perceived infallibility of the physician, which is just not a thing. Doctors are people. And also, I think that when our providers start to get burned out and overworked, they have what we call compassion fatigue, which is a little bit different than the earlier question. It's an experience where they have nothing left to give, right? They have nothing left to give. And so they can't really offer genuine compassion to their patients. And that's a big issue that contributes to this. And I also do think, though it's not my area of expertise, the capitalistic nature of healthcare is a huge problem. The fact that they really focus on how much money they're making, how many patients they're seeing, they have business administrators running the actual business of the hospital, and the focus is on insurance billing and how quickly they're seeing people. So they have a really strong incentive, and for them, the threat of punishment regarding how many people they see, what kinds of procedures they order, and those kinds of things. And I think that is in direct conflict with actually being a human being in a healthcare setting. So that's more an external force. And that can be a hard one to undo in any way. But I think if there's ways to find more access to time, conversation, and humanity within the kind of constructs, the confines of that capitalistic system, there are still ways to do it. But I think that the burnout issue, there are individual level interventions, but it's going to be system level change where people are actually permitted to be fully human themselves and not just sort of a robot in a white coat delivering a diagnosis. And that's a story we tell. That's storytelling that can change that. Tell a different story of who's permitted to be in what space and in what way, and it can affect change. Yeah.
It could have been describing higher education there too.
I know. That's why I say this is not unique to necessarily healthcare. I think anything that's institutionalized starts to become that way. And so and that's why I say you can love an institution and still critique it. And I actually think that's our obligation for the places that we love, for the subjects and disciplines that we love, for the things that are important to us. The best way we can love those things is critique them and make them better.
It'd be a lot easier if you didn't care.
It would be easier if you didn't care. Yeah. And that's why I say, this is all difficult work. If you are in the world of healthcare, health humanities, or you're thinking about stories as impacting power, but it's meaningful. That's the other answer to your question, which is that we try to encourage students to figure out what's going to give them meaning as a person. It might be their patient relationships. It might be the art they make at home on the side, but they have to find a way for the manner in which they're living their life to be infused with actual meaning, whatever that is for them, because otherwise it's unsustainable. And that's true for all of you. It's true for everybody. Figuring out what's meaningful for you, whether it's getting home early to be with your family or really helping people who are in pain. If you can decide for yourself what meaning looks like, then I think these kinds of things are survivable. What else can I tell you?
What do you want to know?
What do you want to know?
What are your goals for today? Will make me look bad.
Nothing.
I was wondering, so like the basis of what you're teaching all your students is like kind of centered around like benefit of the doubt, right? Like whoever you take, like give your care to, it's like kind of like, whatever they look like or however they sound or like yada yada yada. It's like kind of centered around like give them the benefit of the doubt because you don't know what they're going through,
Yeah.
right?
Mhm.
So like, how do you go about teaching that to your students? Because like the storytelling and the internal storytelling.
Yeah. So I used to make them read literary theory. Turns out med students hate that. So I don't do that anymore.
So do they.
I mean, I don't know if anyone likes reading it. Maybe we find it valuable.
Yeah, but we that's why we went creative writing and not literary.
Yeah. Yeah, not, yeah. But so I lean a lot on a discipline called reader response, if any of you are interested in this kind of work. This is a really interesting field if you are an English major or really anybody interested in the kinds of conversations you're having in this class. It started with a woman named Louise Rosenblatt. She wrote this book, I think in 1978, and it's called, I think, the poem, oh God, I'm not gonna get the author, what is it called? The writer, the poem, and the reader, something like that. Okay, that's not it, but her idea is up until she wrote this book, the literary world understood there to be one accurate reading of a book, right? It's either good or bad. And there's a group of people who are qualified to make that determination, mostly critics and publishers, editors, who were deciding for all of us what a good book was, what was included in that, who got to write that, and what sorts of things we valued. She wrote this book and said, I don't think that's right. I think the reader gets to decide what's good and bad. I don't think there's one universal correct reading of any text. And I think that every single individual reader is going to bring to any single individual text her own experiences, her mood, her story, her background, her language, and that this gatekeeping of who gets to decide what's a good story and what's a bad story is all wrong. And she really worked to undo those ideas and says a book is not an object with a final critique that's valid. A book is an event, it's an experience, it's something that takes place over time. And it's something that's interacting with the identity of the reader and the agenda of the reader, right? I always tell my students, what are you reading a book for? If you're reading it to find yourself, if you read a book and you're like, I don't like these characters, nobody looks like me, nobody sounds like me, and you close it, then you're really only looking for yourself in a story. And why is that what's happening? And so what she talks about, what Louise Rosenblatt talks about is first that idea that there's not one universal correct reading of a book, that language is inherently social, but also completely idiosyncratic. Words mean different things to all of us. Phil, I remember a workshop when we were in Nebraska, and I had a piece of writing, and I don't know if you were in the room for this or not, that went up, and I had this sentence that had the word tap as a verb in it. She tapped something. Okay. I meant it the way you would say tap like maple syrup in a tree. The room read it as a sexual euphemism and carried on this whole discussion of how it made no sense in the relationship and blah, 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 blah. And I was like, okay, this was the least helpful workshop ever because there was no sexual relationship, just a total different reading, not necessarily inaccurate, but it certainly made the rest of the story nonsense. This is the idea, right? That we're all going to bring our own context, background, and definitions to every word we read. In that way, language is social, language is idiosyncratic. So what Louise Rosenblatt writes about is, okay, if this is the way we understand books, a totally new way of understanding them. One, it means everyone gets to write and everyone gets to read, and there's no right or wrong. You love the books you love. Don't you apologize for all that sci-fi you're reading or whatever else. There's no good, there's no bad. The next part of it is, it means that when you're reading, you have the story as it's coming to you, but you also have this sort of, she calls it the second stream. It's this second sort of story that's happening. And that story is your response to whatever you're reading. That's sort of its own narrative that's going on simultaneously. And it's how you respond, right? It's why you love certain books. It's why certain moments make you cry. It's why they evoke memories of your mom. It's why whatever it is that's happening for you in the storytelling you're doing is almost like this second story that's happening. So what she says is you can pay attention to that. You can describe it. You can identify it. It can help you figure out why you hate certain stories, right? Ever since I had children, I can't handle stories where kids die. Can't do it. I used to be fine, didn't touch me, but now it pokes me in my mother bone. It's too hard. And so I know because of my own context, I have little kids, that I can't really receive those stories because it's too painful to know that there's real harm that gets done to children. That's got nothing to do with any of you in this room. You might read those same stories and sort of be like, it's incredibly moving, how important. I love this story, right? So the idea is that you can pay attention to and describe this second stream as it's happening. And that means you can interrogate it. It means you can ask questions about why you interpret other people's stories the way you do, and you can change it if you want, or you can notice it and lean into it. So I teach that work to my students. I used to make them read it. Now I teach it to them because I don't want them to actually actively hate me. And then this is what we do, right? We read books and I tell them, I care about whether you like the book or not. I care way more about why. I care way more about what your interpretation of the story was and what you think informed that interpretation. I want that second stream. I want to be in your brain as you're making sense of another person's story. And then I want us to take that apart. And I want you to question all the things you feel like are informing. And that doesn't mean you have to reject them, but it means you have to notice them and describe them, because that's how you do equity work. That's how you are able to receive stories that feel different from you. That's how you're able to engage with people who you don't understand or who come from a totally different cultural background from you. Because you're able to pay attention to the ways you're making meaning of their story and dissect that and choose the ways that give them dignity, respect, humanity, choose the ways that don't invalidate their story. So we actively do that. And that means I introduce these theoretical ideas to them, just as I did with you here. And then we read a bunch of books. We read memoirs, we read essays, we read all kinds of stuff. I show them lots of videos of people telling stories so that we can do this interpretive work together in real time and sort of get into the weeds. It's why, what I always say is I love it when I teach a book to the class and half the class hates the book and half the class loves the book. I'm like, this is it. There's a reason why half of you love it and half of you hate it. Let's have it out, because that's an indication that reading any particular story is really just a function of each of you as people, whether you like it or not, how you think about it or not. So that's how we teach it. And really, that's, if you really want to get into these ideas of story and power, of stigma, it's this stuff, right? So if you're thinking about folks who are incarcerated, you could have a group of students or healthcare providers think about or read narratives and memoirs of people who have had these kinds of experiences and encourage them to critically engage with potential resistance to another person's humanity. Part of the point of a program like mine is the fundamental idea that you can learn to do this stuff and you can learn to do it well, that it's teachable, right? Empathy is not a thing that you just have to hope intuitively happens. It's not about feeling sad for other people. It's this really attentive, intentional, critical thinking that I'm describing to you now that has to do with the ways in which you receive other stories, right? It's this sort of self-interrogation and it never stops. You have to do it your entire life and continue to pay attention to the stories that you are using as your interpretive lens. So that's how we teach it. And some students really like it. And I always say too, here's the other thing about all this kind of work and all the projects you're talking about, they require a lot of discomfort. They really require being willing to be uncomfortable, being willing to interrogate your own self, asking people to question what they think they know about another group of people. and potentially sitting in spaces that are uncomfortable. And so that means a lot. I think we have an obligation to one another if we're going to do this work to be really tender. It requires gentleness, because no one's going to do it if it feels like a battle, and that's fair. So that's kind of that's the nature of the classroom that I have, and those are the kinds of things that we do together. And if you're ever interested in some of this work or summaries of it, these are really great foundational ideas for all the projects that you mentioned that you're thinking about. And I will also say too, they're sort of foundational to narrative medicine. They're built into that too. What else can I tell you? Do you have other thoughts or questions? Are there other things you want to know more about that I may or may not have information on?
Yeah, I'm interested in, like, you've kind of touched on it a little bit, just sprinkled it in kind of indirectly. So I was wondering how you go about teaching empathy, especially to students who have grown up in all sorts of different housing situations, parent situations, all sorts of things. And like, kind of, we've just been learning about it in my child development classes and like parenting styles and how parents are essentially role models, because those kids are learning. They don't know what like relationships are. They don't understand that yet, and love, and they don't understand, like, kids in college are just starting to figure out, wow, my mom did so much for me to get me here, right? So how do you go about teaching adults empathy?
That's a great question. So I will say, I like that you make those distinctions, because I think that different audiences require very, very different approaches, right? Y'all are self-selecting into this class. You're interested in these things. You are not unlike some of the medical students I have. And I have learned over the years that they don't need instruction on empathy from me. They've come into medical school extremely eager to help people. What they need is to have their empathy protected and not crushed out of them by their training process, which means protecting them as people. I used to teach empathy and talk about empathy with them, and they were sort of like, we took the MCAT and went through the interview process in order to get myself into a position so that I could help people. You know, I don't need to be told that I should care about people. I need to be told that it's okay for me to care about people in this space. So that's really become more the way I think about it with students, especially those taking an elective with me. However, we have people, as everyone does, who really are after status and power, good grades and all those kinds of things. And so for them, we have to take what feels almost like a strategic approach, which feels a little strange, but the goal is to protect their patients. And so we tell them there's all kinds of data out there that you can find, and research that's been done on the fact that if you deliver your care compassionately, you're going to have better outcomes, which means you'll have fewer lawsuits, and you will have patients who adhere to their treatment plans. And that means they'll come back, and that means you'll do more procedures and make more money. And so there's all these really practical ways. There's a book called Compassionomics, if you really want to dig into this. And it's about all of the sort of practical, measurable benefits of being compassionate in healthcare. It's slightly terrifying, because we should just believe that that's the right thing to do, but that's not the case with everybody. So for younger learners who are resistant, that's a great place to start. And I think it's also a good place to start for adults who have been doing this job for a long time and who are like, who is this wackadoo novelist coming in telling me how to do my job better? You know, a lot of it is they want to start with the data. So that's a big one. And looking at the work of someone like Danny Ofrey, who does a lot of literature review, looks at communication data, or this book Compassionomics and work like that, and showing evidence that there are practical benefits, monetary and otherwise, to delivering compassionate care. That's just to get them to begin to listen. And then I think the conversation has to be, again, really gentle. and say, this is really difficult, you're really burned out. I don't, intend to tell anyone how to do their job, but this will benefit your patients and it will benefit you. The state of Iowa where I live has an abnormally high rate of maternal mortality for Black women who deliver their babies here at Iowa. There's nobody else doing that harm but us at this hospital. So we really have to be willing to do, again, that uncomfortable work of looking at what we're doing wrong, because there's really no getting around the story that it's us causing the harm. So I think one is starting with that, those compelling pieces of information that you will be better off as a person, as a provider, more successful and all these things if you do this work with empathy. And then in terms of teaching how to do empathy, I really do tend to take a more intellectual, imaginative approach, right? You don't necessarily have to feel all the feelings of your patients. I think of the work of Anatole Broyard. He's a writer who wrote this book called Intoxicated by My Illness. And he has this part in it where he says, I see no reason or need for my doctor to love me, nor would I expect him to suffer with me. I wouldn't demand a lot of my doctor's time. I just wish he would brood on my situation for 5 minutes, that he would give me his whole mind just once. So, and you can see I've taught this a lot because it comes right off the tip of my tongue, but he says it's about attention and presence. And so we talk about, what does that mean? That means for a few minutes stepping away from the computer. That means giving your whole attention. You don't have to take on the feelings and sorrows and sufferings of everybody, but you can give them your whole mind for 5 minutes, and that's a gift. And so we think practically of ways to apply this. Sometimes we actually do this thing where one of the other things we teach is a lot of our students and providers want tricks, things that they can keep in their mind before entering a room. So sometimes they'll say, I'm going to think of this person as a child, and I'm going to enter their reality the way that I would enter the reality of a child, not in a patronizing way, in the way that if a 5-year-old stubs his toe and he's hysterically crying, you can't tell him that it's not a big deal. That's not going to stop the pain or the crying. But what you can do is say, it sounds like that really hurts. Tell me what you need from me. I have a doctor who says, she thinks often about her way of going about it practically is, I always ask myself, is the information or the direction I'm giving to my patient for them according to their agenda and story, or is it for me? Is what I think they need? If it's for me, then I'm doing it wrong, and I have to check that immediately. And even though that's sort of a practical technique, it's how she gets to a place where she's delivering empathetic care. So we actually do a lot of not scripts, but tools and techniques, and even sort of things, the mantras and things you keep in your mind that will help them get to a place sort of imaginatively where they can be empathetic to other people. So sometimes it's teaching fundamentally first why you should care, and then second, how do you actually do that? What's the application? Some of that is narrative medicine. Some of those techniques that you'll read about, right? And the sort of the ideas of attention and representation and affiliation that you've probably learned about, but it's different for everybody. And so we spend a lot of time saying, how is this going to work for you? What's it going to look like, right? Approach it with curiosity and make sure that the questions and the directions are for the patient and not for you, according to what you want to happen in a setting. So that's how we kind of teach it with our older learners, but that compassionomics and some of those things can be really interesting, useful tools to look at that data of evidence that this is important. Even if you can't kind of wrap your mind around the moral imperative, you can wrap your mind around the practical outcomes. What else? Anything else you can think of?
What is your next step?
My next step. Yeah. So if it's useful to know or not, part of the reason I'm leaving the position is because there's so much institutional resistance to these ideas, not necessarily with individual people or any kind of blame or responsibility, but generally within the healthcare setting, there's just not a lot of space for this. And some of those things I described, it's really codified to, there's a lot of incentive in the way things are practically to go about this a different way, right? So those rubrics of professionalism, our students get find success based on their test scores. They have to take board exams during med school and some of these kinds of things. And so what we're doing is under-resourced and de-emphasized. And that's okay, right? I have a colleague who always says, this kind of work is guerrilla work. You're not the general, you're the guerrilla warriors. And that's the way it's going to be. So that's okay. For me, I grew just big enough as a program to start to catch the attention of the deans, which meant I couldn't protect my students as successfully anymore. One of my colleagues was like, you got a target on your back now because so many people want to do this kind of work, which is suspect. So it became, I felt that I was no longer able to serve my students the way that I wanted to, which was by protecting them. And so it seems like it's right for the next person to take it over and step into that role of really trying to protect them as people. For me, I'm going to write books for a while. One of them is about personal statements. If you're ever thinking about some of your professional development, one of the books I'm going to work on is how you write things like personal statements and cover letters as a way to sort of reclaim your agency in your story, as a place to start. Heading into a school, an institution, or a job where you're telling the story of who you are in that world according to your version of the story and not kind of who you think you should be in that space, so that you can kind of protect your agency heading into any kind of institution that may try to strip you of that agency and tell you the kind of person you're supposed to be rather than who you genuinely are, and how you can still do that well and still do it in a way that you will get that job or get into medical school or get that residency position. And I think that's a way to continue to do this kind of good work broadly and publicly. And I think that's an important way to think about entering any institution, is knowing what your agenda is, what your priorities are, what your values are, and letting those guide you. That's a way to protect, I think, your own humanity. What else can I tell you? I went totally off script, y'all. So there's all kinds of stuff to talk about, but if you have other things you're interested in, let me know. I don't know, we have 10 minutes, is that right?
Yeah.
Ish,
Yeah.
okay.
What's the hardest part about writing a book? You're writing like multiple books.
What's the hardest part about writing a book?
What's the hardest part about writing a book or writing multiple books? Okay, well, that's a great question. The hardest part, so my favorite thing to write is fiction. I thought I was a nonfiction writer. I wrote a lot of nonfiction and I just was lying left and right. And finally I was like, oh, that's fiction. And so for me, it's the most fun to write fiction, but it's also the most challenging because I have really come to believe that there's no such thing as art for art's sake, that our stories have impact in the world, have consequences in the world, that the stories we choose to tell are related to power and who has power and who's telling what kind of story. And so I think that same intentionality that I've been talking about all morning really should go with the art that you make as well, and the fiction that you write, and the nonfiction that you write, and the essays that you put together. And the personal statements and cover letters that you write, because it has all to do with power. So I think the hardest part is making sure that it's a story worth telling, that I'm doing justice to a person who spends $12 to buy my fiction, not letting them down, but telling a story that should be told, that has a place in the world and that is doing something toward whatever kind of equity I have in mind. I believe in that. I believe that, like Ibram Kendi says, there is really no neutral. All stories have power one way or another. And so understanding the ways in which you're using or engaging with that is really important. It makes it really difficult. So that's hard, very, very fun, but very, very hard. The nonfiction work for me in particular, this one is more straightforward because it's writing about things that all are in my brain already. I just have to get them down in an orderly manner on the page. I love language, and so it's a place to mess with language, and I love telling anecdotes and stories that demonstrate the ideas that I'm introducing. So that's all really fun, but I don't find it as challenging as really writing excellent fiction. Was anyone in here a fiction writer?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I was raising my hand for a question, but I'm also a fiction writer.
Raise your hand for a question. What's your question?
Yeah, so I'm wanting to look into master's programs.
Yeah.
Would you recommend a creative writing master's program for somebody who wants to write creatively later in life?
Mhm.
Or would you recommend like doing, like not doing an intense creative writing program so you don't get burnt out on that
Yeah.
before writing, like professionally?
Yeah. I think, and I think a lot of different people will say different things. I think it really depends on your goals. So I went to get my master's, my MFA, because I needed help. I was like not a good writer. I had some like natural ability and a lot of interest and passion. I was writing these like 28-page scrambly chapters that like went nowhere, but like something was there and I needed someone to tell me how to do it. And I knew that I needed structure. I needed deadlines, I needed accountability, and I knew my goal was to write a novel. So those were sort of my circumstances. And I felt like the only way I'm going to get what I need to make me as good of a writer as I can be is formal instruction. I didn't do it till I was older. I had lived in the world for a while. And so I didn't go straight out of undergrad. I needed to go have some lived experiences that, you know, formed and malformed me as a person and gave me something to write about. And I think other people would say they never really needed the MFA world because they were sort of able to be self-taught and practice and reading was enough for them. But the big part of any kind of, I think, higher education, maybe the most valuable is the community that you meet and the support that you get and the relationships that you forge that inform your work. So if that's something that's valuable to you as a creative writer, as an artist, as a person thinking about the words you want to put out into the world, then it can be enormously valuable. I can tell you, as you heard Phil said, I used to be ashamed of this and I got made fun of a lot, but now I own it because no shame is allowed anymore. It took me 3 different MFA programs to find the one that was right for me. I moved to Tallahassee, Florida for a semester. It was not the right choice, but finding the right program was really important. And that's to say lots of different programs are really, really different. So knowing what you want, and then finding the right program by talking to people about different programs is my best advice. It's going to be, you get to pick what's right for you. If those things are important and valuable to you, it's absolutely worth your time and your money. I would never be a writer if I hadn't gone. Other people would say MFA programs are worthless and it's not important and you don't need it. That was not true for me.
I'd add, I would echo that. And I actually had a similar experience. I went and worked for a while. Some of you know this. And then I got a master's degree in English before I did my MFA in writing. What I would say too about to me, one of the things I, in hindsight, appreciated about the graduate experience. I mean, relationships like this one, that's 20, no, not that, we're not that old, 15 years old or so. But also, when you're in a graduate experience at whatever level, but then also when you have the great privilege, I think, even despite the headaches from time to time, the great privilege of working around really credentialed, really smart people, particularly in the arts, is if you're gonna like endure and have and improve and stay, I think you really have to start to become aware of what you know, and that sentence starts to change. And you might catch me saying it in classes where I'm asking you to talk with me about what you think you know, and it's that idea where I'm sort of constantly aware in a good way. Okay, if I'm going to put this out there, I need to, like, do I really think it? And why do I think it? And am I prepared to vet my ideas in this space? And to me, it's one of the most valuable parts of the workshop experience is getting comfortable in that give and take, getting comfortable saying, here's something I think I know. Is it working? Am I assuming things that aren't true or aren't clear? And if so, I need to know that. You get comfortable in that space and you start to take it less personally, and you start realizing, we talk about intentionality, this is that part where you start training as a writer. It teaches you a certain way of thinking, I believe, or as a graduate student, it teaches you or trains you to get comfortable. I've got a creative writing workshop next week that starts, and how you go into a workshop, your attitude and your goals matter. They determine to a large degree how well that workshop will go for you. If you're going in to have praise heaped upon you and to be told how wonderful you are and how awesome you are, it ain't gonna go well. And so you have to go in saying, this isn't done, I need help, I'd like to see what other people think, and if I'm off base, then maybe I can make some changes. It's a really important skill, even if like just for living with other people, treating one another. Like it's that you talk about I found interesting that like, what are the little mental things? It's like take a moment before you walk in the room and calibrate and ask yourself, what are my intentions, and where is my mind, and where is my heart at the moment? I was reminded of a story that Bill Clinton told about teamwork in the presidency. And he said, I'd be sitting in the Oval Office and I would have the military advisors with me, and they'd say, listen, you need to retaliate today, and you need to send a message today, otherwise you're going to look weak. You need to shoot the missile off today. And President Clinton sort of backed up and said, well, listen, can I kill him tomorrow? Like, are they going to be there tomorrow?
Yeah.
If I can kill him tomorrow, I'll still look strong, but we can talk about it for 24 hours.
Yeah.
And I think just having that ability to be confident in, or to own, like, it's not to be ashamed of those things is, I don't, to me, I'm not saying it as eloquently as I could, but I think Cate was absolutely correct to talk about what are your goals. So maybe you just want the credential. We all do quite a few things for those credentials.
Right.
Also, it is that it's really ideally what all education should be about.
Yeah.
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 It's a great question.
Yeah. Anything else? Any final thoughts or questions?
I just want to say thank you, Cate. This is wonderful. I know that we're going to have a wonderful class anyway, but we're going to be energized going into next week, and their work's going to be even better, and our conversation is going to be even better because of this. I knew you would say all manner of things really well, and really, I've been working on an online course that has been draining the soul from me, and you reignited my sort of defiance to keep the humanity in it. So I want to thank you for that.
Yeah.
So we'll talk hopefully before your speech. I used to do speech together, so if you have any questions,
okay.
I'm always happy to help. Not that, please, you don't need it.
I
Everyone, please say thank you and
thank you.
Well,
Thank you
we'll
so
talk
much.
soon.
Yeah, we'll talk soon. If there's anything anyone wants to know or email or anything, always let me know.
All right, I got your email.
Okay.
Thanks, Cate.
Thanks, y'all. Have a good day, everybody.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye. I don't know, I see on it.